How do you put into words something that changed your life forever? Something that still shows up in your nightmares decades later? I guess the best way is to just talk to you, like I would a friend. So here it is. Let me ask you this. What would you do if you knew you were going to die tomorrow? Would you fight for every last breath, or would you try to make peace with it? I didn't think much about that question before August 1915. Back then I was just a young soldier stuck in Auschwitz fortress, surrounded by miles of swamp and thousands of Germans who wanted us dead. Life wasn't easy, but it wasn't complicated either. You follow orders, you shoot when they tell you to shoot, and you try not to think too much about what happens next. But the thing about war is, it doesn't let you stay the same. It breaks you down, rebuilds you into something you don't recognize, and then asks you to prove it's enough. And that's what happened to me. To us at Auschwitz. What we faced there, it wasn't just war. It was something worse, something I wouldn't believe if I hadn't lived it. But I did live it. Barely. This isn't a hero story, it's not a legend. It's just what happened, and I think it's time I told it. They told us Auschwitz fortress couldn't hold out much longer. For 6 months, we'd heard nothing but grim predictions. The Germans will starve you out. You'll choke on their artillery. They'll drown you in blood. But somehow, the old stone walls stood, and so did we. 900 of us, tucked inside that cold, swamp-locked bastion, facing 7,000 Germans entrenched in the surrounding marshland. When you sit in a fortress long enough, the walls don't just protect you, they trap you. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, until boredom became our most insidious enemy. By August, the trenches outside weren't filled with charging infantry or the crack of rifle fire. No, they were filled with silence. The Germans didn't bother with small attacks anymore, and we didn't dare provoke them. That morning I stood atop the north wall, gazing out over the swamps with Private Boris Sokolov. Boris was only 18, fresh out of a fishing village on the Baltic coast. His boots were too big, his uniform too stiff, and his laugh too loud. Yet he had the kind of wide-eyed optimism I envied. To him, war was still an adventure. "Look," Boris said, pointing to the nearest German trench about 400 meters away. A group of officers stood huddled there, gesturing animatedly at the ground, then the sky. It was odd. Normally, they kept their heads down. "What do you think they're doing?" he asked. "Who knows?" I replied, trying to sound indifferent. Truthfully, the sight unnerved me. The Germans had been quiet for too long, and quiet Germans meant one thing: planning. I didn't trust plans I couldn't see, Boris shrugged. "Boris, maybe they're summoning a demon to swallow us whole." "Don't be ridiculous," I snapped, though the thought lingered longer than I'd admit. I had no intention of reporting it. Junior officers like me didn't earn respect by crying wolf over every unusual movement. Still, the sight stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. 3 days later, the air turned on us. It started just before dawn. I was off duty, lying on my cot in the eastern barracks, when a commotion erupted above. Shouts echoed from the walls, boots thundered against stone, and someone yelled, "Gas! Gas!" I bolted upright. Heart hammering. Gas? We'd heard rumors of the Germans using chemical weapons on other fronts, but here... I grabbed my rifle and raced outside, joining the scramble of soldiers pouring toward the walls. The air smelled wrong, bitter, acrid, like burnt metal mixed with spoiled onions. My throat burned with every breath. When I reached the northern battlement, my stomach twisted. A cloud the color of rotting moss rolled toward us, blanketing the swamp in its path. Where it touched grass, the blades shriveled into brittle black stalks. Birds plummeted mid-flight, their bodies striking the ground with lifeless finality. "What the hell is that?" Boris asked beside me, his voice high-pitched with panic. "Chlorine," someone muttered. "Maybe worse." "Get wet rags. Cover your faces," an officer bellowed. I ripped off my scarf, soaked it in the nearest water barrel, and tied it around my nose and mouth. The damp cloth provided little relief. My lungs felt like they were filling with knives. A coughing fit overtook me, and I doubled over, clutching the wall for support. Around me, men were dropping, clutching their throats, their eyes red and streaming tears. Some staggered, vomiting blood. The gas wasn't just killing us, it was tearing us apart. Through the haze of pain and panic, I saw movement in the trenches. The Germans were advancing. Hundreds of them poured out like ants, rifles gleaming under the faint light of dawn. Machine guns opened fire, peppering our walls with lead. Artillery joined the barrage, shaking the ground beneath our boots. "Man your positions," someone shouted, but it was useless. The men couldn't even breathe, let alone fight. The fortress was doomed. We all knew it. And then Vladimir spoke. I've never known Vladimir Kotlinski to be afraid. He was young, maybe a year older than me, but he carried himself like a man twice his age. He wasn't the loudest, the strongest, or even the sharpest among us, but when he spoke, we listened. Maybe it was his stubbornness, his refusal to ever back down, that made us believe in him. That morning, with gas ripping through our lungs and the Germans bearing down on us, he stood tall in the courtyard, his uniform streaked with blood from coughing fits. Around him, 100 men still clung to life, though just barely. Their faces were gray, their bodies trembling. Many leaned on rifles for support, and some stared blankly, their minds broken by the horror around them. Vladimir raised his voice, hoarse but unyielding. "This is not the end," he roared. "If they want this fortress, they will pay for every inch of it with their blood." A few men looked up, their eyes flickering with faint recognition. Most just coughed or groaned, too far gone to process his words. But Vladimir didn't stop. "We may die here," he continued, pacing the courtyard, his bayonet gleaming in the dim light. "But we do not die as cowards. We do not die as victims. We die as soldiers, as Russians, as men who refuse to kneel." The fire in his voice sparked something in me, something raw and primal. It wasn't hope, that was long gone. No, it was rage. A deep, guttural fury at the idea of letting those bastards outside win. Vladimir turned to me, his bloodshot eyes boring into mine. "Sergei," he said, addressing me by name for the first time, "gather anyone who can stand. We march." We didn't have a plan. Hell, we barely had weapons. The gas had fouled the powder in our rifles, leaving most useless. Some men carried bayonets, others knives or sharpened stakes ripped from the walls. A few of us picked up discarded German rifles, though we had no idea how many shots were left in them. There were no cheers, no rallying cries, just the sound of labored breathing, boots scraping against stone, and the faint creak of the fortress gates as we pushed them open. The Germans were waiting. Hundreds of them had lined up in neat rows, their rifles trained on the gates. Behind them, machine gunners and mortar crews prepared for the final push. They must have thought the gas had finished us off. When the gates swung wide and they saw us, wheezing, blood-soaked, staggering like drunkards, they hesitated. I don't blame them. We must have looked like something out of a nightmare. Then Vladimir screamed. It wasn't a battle cry, not really. It was raw, animalistic, the sound of a man refusing to die quietly. He raised his bayonet and charged, and we followed, shambling after him with whatever strength we had left. The first wave of Germans broke almost instantly. They weren't expecting resistance, let alone a full-blown charge. Some fired wildly, missing in their panic. Others dropped their weapons and fled, shouting warnings to their comrades. "Zombies!" one of them screamed in German. "They're dead! They're already dead!" The chaos spread faster than the gas. Men tripped over each other in their rush to escape, tangling themselves in barbed wire and collapsing into the trenches. We didn't stop. I stabbed the first man I saw, my bayonet sinking into his chest with a sickening crunch. His eyes widened in shock, then glazed over as he fell. Vladimir was ahead of me, a whirlwind of fury. He swung his rifle like a club, shattering bones and sending men sprawling. Blood streamed from his nose and mouth, but he didn't slow down. "Keep moving," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. We surged forward, tearing into the German lines with everything we had. Bayonets, knives, fists. It didn't matter. We were dying anyway, and we made damn sure they knew it. In the trenches, the real slaughter began. The Germans who hadn't fled were trapped, their retreat blocked by the very defenses they'd built. Some tried to fight, but their fear betrayed them, their shots going wide or their hands trembling too much to reload. Others simply froze, their faces pale as we descended on them like demons. I don't remember how many I killed. It all blurred together, the screams, the blood, the feeling of steel meeting flesh. At one point, my bayonet snapped, leaving me with nothing but the jagged edge of a broken rifle. I swung it like a club, the weight of the weapon jarring my shoulders with every impact. Vladimir fought like a man possessed. He took a bayonet to the gut but barely flinched, grabbing the German who stabbed him and slamming him against the trench wall. Blood poured from his mouth as he spat in the man's face, then drove his fist into his skull with a sickening crunch. By the time we ran out of ammunition, the Germans had all but collapsed. The survivors fled deeper into the swamp, abandoning their trenches and leaving their dead behind. We staggered after them, too angry to stop, picking up discarded weapons as we went. It wasn't until we reached the far edge of the swamp that Vladimir finally called us back. "Enough," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Back to the fortress. Prepare to destroy it." I looked around at the men beside me. There were only a handful left. Maybe 20, if that. All of us were bleeding, coughing, barely standing. But we were alive. For now. When we stumbled back through the gates of Osovets, the air inside was thick with death. The gas still clung to the walls, its acrid stench burning my nose even through the soaked rag tied around my face. The bodies of our comrades lay where they'd fallen, crumpled in pools of blood and bile. The fortress had become a tomb. For a moment, no one spoke. We stood there in silence, gripping our weapons like talismans against the reality settling over us. Only Vladimir moved, dragging himself toward the central courtyard, his hand pressed against the bayonet still embedded in his stomach. Blood seeped between his fingers, leaving a dark trail behind him. "Get the charges," he rasped, his voice barely audible. I hesitated. "Captain, do it," he snapped, cutting me off. His glare silenced any further argument. We'd prepared for this months ago, long before the gas, the siege, or the trenches. The explosives were our last resort, meant to deny the enemy the prize they so desperately wanted. If the fortress fell, it would fall on our terms. As we worked, the remaining men trickled into the courtyard, dragging their broken bodies behind them. Some leaned on each other for support. Others collapsed the moment they crossed the threshold. Boris was among them, his face pale and streaked with soot. His left arm hung limp at his side, a jagged piece of shrapnel protruding from his shoulder. "We're blowing it up, aren't we?" he asked, his voice flat. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Good," he muttered, slumping against the wall. "Let them choke on the rubble." The explosives were stored in the eastern barracks, tucked away beneath the floorboards. As I pulled the crates free, I couldn't help but notice the quiet. Outside, the Germans were regrouping. Their artillery had fallen silent, and their machine guns no longer raked the walls. I imagined them huddled in their trenches, whispering about the horrors they'd seen, too afraid to press the attack. They wouldn't wait forever. By the time we set the last charge, the sun had begun to rise, casting the swamp in an eerie orange glow. The gas cloud had thinned, drifting in patches through the trees, but its effects lingered. Every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. My vision blurred, and my legs threatened to give out with every step. Vladimir stood in the center of the courtyard, his rifle slung over one shoulder, his other hand clutching the bayonet in his gut. His uniform was soaked with blood, the fabric clinging to his skin like a second layer. Yet his eyes burned with the same defiance that had carried us through the trenches. "Listen to me," he said, his voice stronger than it had any right to be. "What we've done here today will be remembered, not for the glory or the victory, but for the refusal. We refused to break, to kneel." He paused, scanning the faces of the men around him. "When they write about this war, they'll say we were already dead. Let them, the dead do not surrender." I don't remember much after that. The charges were set, the fuses laid, and we made our way to the western gate where the swamp offered our only chance of escape. The fortress groaned around us, its ancient walls buckling under the strain of artillery and time. Boris was the last to cross the threshold, his steps unsteady. I reached out to steady him, but he shook his head. "Go," he muttered. "I'll catch up." I didn't argue, there was no time. When the first explosion hit, it was like the earth itself had split open. The walls of Osovets crumbled inward, stone and mortar collapsing in a deafening roar. Dust and debris filled the air, choking what little breath we had left. I turned back once just in time to see the central tower collapse in on itself, a plume of smoke and flame rising into the sky. The Germans wouldn't get their prize, and neither would we. We stumbled into the swamp, coughing and bleeding, with no sense of direction beyond a way. The gas hung low in the trees, its acrid tendrils licking at our heels. Every step felt heavier than the last, my legs dragging through the mud as if the swamp itself wanted to swallow me whole. By the time the explosions faded, the swamp was silent. The fortress was gone. Vladimir was gone. By the time we reached the edge of the swamp, there were only 7 of us left. 7 men out of 900 who had held that fortress for 6 months, who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. I don't remember much about the journey. The days blurred together in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Boris collapsed on the second night, his fever raging. We tried to carry him, but he shook his head, muttering something about the sea and his mother. We left him beneath a crooked birch tree, the gas cloud creeping ever closer. The others fell one by one, swallowed by the swamp, their bodies too broken to carry on. I didn't stop to mourn them. I couldn't. There was only forward, only survival. It was nearly a week before I saw another human face. A patrol of Russian soldiers found me on the outskirts of a small village, barely more than a husk of a man. I don't remember what I said to them, if I said anything at all. They took me to a field hospital, where a doctor examined my raw throat and blistered skin with a grim shake of his head. "You should be dead," he muttered. "Not yet," I rasped. In the weeks that followed, I learned what had become of Osovets. The Germans had finally taken the ruins, but the fortress they'd fought so hard to claim was useless to them. Our charges had reduced it to rubble, the railways and supply routes buried under tons of stone. They found Vladimir's body near the courtyard, still clutching the bayonet that had killed him. His face was frozen in a grimace, his eyes wide and unyielding, as if daring death itself to claim him. The Germans called us zombies. Stories spread like wildfire, of dead men marching through gas and fire, of soldiers too stubborn to die. It was absurd, of course. We weren't zombies, we were just men. But the legend grew. I was discharged from the army a month later. My lungs were too damaged to fight, and the scars on my throat made speaking a painful chore. I returned to a small village far from the front, where no one knew my name or what I'd done. For years I avoided the stories. I didn't want to hear about Vladimir or Boris or the fortress. I didn't want to remember the way the gas smelled, or how it felt to stab a man and see the life drain from his eyes. But the stories found me anyway. They came in songs, in poems, in whispered tales told around campfires. People spoke of us like we were heroes, like what we did meant something, and maybe it did. But when I close my eyes, all I see are the bodies, the swamp swallowing them whole, the fortress crumbling around us. I didn't survive Osovets, not really. Not. Part of me is still there, walking those walls, waiting for the gas to roll in. If you've heard the story before, you know how it ends. Vladimir Kotlinsky, the man who refused to die, was awarded Russia's highest honor. Statues were built in his name. Songs were written about his bravery, and the rest of us? We disappeared, like ghosts. I'm not telling you this to be remembered. I'm not even sure why I'm telling you at all. Maybe it's because I'm tired of carrying it alone. Maybe it's because someone needs to know the truth. We weren't heroes. We were just men. Men who didn't know how to stop fighting. Men who refused to fall quietly. Men who turned a fortress into a graveyard. And when the world remembers Osovets, it remembers the fortress, the gas, the zombies. It forgets the swamp.